The modern state of South Africa is home to the UNESCO World Heritage Site named Cradle of Humankind. This location holds the largest known concentration of human ancestral remains anywhere in the world. But prior to European contact, much of the land near what would become the Cape Colony in South Africa wasn't particularly densely populated, as it was used primarily for seasonal pastoral farming. The two largest groups in the area were the San and the Khoikhoi people, often collectively known to European scholars as the Khoisan. The climate and soil around the Cape made farming difficult with plants that were native to the area. As a result, the San were primarily hunter-gatherer communities, while the Khoikhoi tended toward nomadic herding of cattle. Both used the Cape of South Africa seasonally for hunting and herding respectively. Portuguese explorer Bartolomé Dias was the first European to reach the coastline of South Africa in 1488. He came seeking a route around Africa to Asia, and when he reached the southern tip of Africa, he declared it Cabas de Tormentas, translating to Cape of Storms. But King John II of Portugal renamed it Cape of Good Hope, likely to encourage more to attempt the journey and open trade routes. In February of 1510, a Portuguese fleet returning from India stopped at Table Bay to attempt to gather water for the return trip. There they made contact with a native group and engaged in some trade. Accounts of what happened next differ, with each side claiming the other started the conflict by attempting to steal from the other. Regardless, Portuguese officers decided to conduct a raid on the locals, sending a force of approximately 150 armed with swords, crossbows, and shields to raid a nearby village. But when they arrived, they found the village was empty. They were then ambushed by a force of around 170 men, armed with spears, stones, and poison-tipped arrows, who used their cattle to sneak up and attack. 64 Portuguese soldiers were killed as they attempted to flee, including the captain. The Portuguese Navy had strict rules against landing ships in this region that the captain was in violation of, and this event, later known as the Battle of Salt River, led to stricter enforcement. Over 120 years later, in March of 1647, a Dutch vessel was shipwrecked. They were forced to set up an emergency settlement that they called the Sand Fort of the Cape of Good Hope. After nearly a year they were rescued, but some of the crew wanted to convince the Dutch East India Company to send an expedition to establish a port where ships could resupply during trips to Asia. They wrote, quote, "We say, therefore, that the Honorable Company, by the formation of a fort or redoubt, and also of a garden of such size as may be practical or necessary at the above-mentioned Cabo de Boas Esperanza, upon a suitable spot in Table Valley, stationing there according to your pleasure, 60 to 70, as well soldiers as sailors, and a few persons acquainted with gardening and horticulture, could raise, as well for the ships and people bound to India as those returning thence, many kinds of fruit, as will hereafter be more particularly demonstrated." The company took this advice, and 90 Dutch Calvinist settlers arrived on April 6, 1652 on 5 ships, all under contract to work for the Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC. The colonists built a fort out of clay and timber, as the original plan was for the colony to remain small. They were there to grow food for the fort, for the colony, and for ships, and to purchase meat from the Khoikhoi for the same purpose. But very soon after its creation, the colony found itself in conflict with the pastoral groups that used the land, with the Dutch building farms and fortifications that fenced in what was previously pastures without asking permission. This led to the Khoikhoi engaging in cattle raids of the Dutch farmers in retaliation. The Dutch colonists had been given strict instructions to not engage in conflict with the people of the area, but the colonists believed war was inevitable. When a Khoikhoi cattle raid led to the death of a Dutch settler, a number of skirmishes took place, until in 1660 a formal peace treaty could be negotiated. The initial fort was upgraded in 1666, and in 1671 the colony formally negotiated a lease with the Khoikhoi people, whom the Dutch referred to as the Hottentots, to expand settlement beyond the fort. In an effort to set up farming communities in the area around the colony, 9 of the colonists requested and were granted release from their contracts with the VOC in exchange for land grants to set up independent farming communities which would supply the colony as long as they agreed to stay on the land for at least 20 years. These farms had the advantage of being able to grow crops that were brought from Europe and Asia and the Americas which were not native to the area. Plants such as oranges, lemons, and grapefruits, bananas, and figs were all new introductions to the area. As a result, they were able to set up productive farms and orchards to grow fruit, vegetables, medicinal plants, and other things they could sell back to the VOC to repay leases or purchase more land. But the Khoikhoi were not able to take advantage of these new trading partners or available farming options, as having little prior exposure to Europeans, they were soon devastated by smallpox epidemics that had estimated mortality rates as high as 90% of their total population. Even the survivors of these epidemics found their cattle separately exposed to a disease of European origin, which reportedly killed 4 out of 5 of their cattle herd. All of this dramatically affected the Khoikhoi ability to maintain their pastoral cultural traditions on the same scale. While they generally maintained their independence, many were forced to take jobs working for the colony as herders, and many of their children attended school set up for the Dutch independent farmers. In the early days of the colony, in 1657, there were only 134 total European settlers. As a result, labor, particularly labor familiar with the crops and farming techniques needed to cultivate non-native crops, was in very short supply. To address this shortage, the VOC bought slaves from the Indonesian colonies and other parts of Africa to the colony. In 1657, there were reportedly 10 enslaved people in the colonies. But the following year, a Dutch ship captured a Portuguese slave ship with 500 Angolan slaves. 250 of these slaves were taken to the Cape Colony. Another 288 slaves were brought just 2 months later. Over time, thousands of slaves were brought to the colony, often being sold to the colony by Dutch merchants who were returning home, as slavery was legal in Dutch colonies, but was illegal in the Netherlands themselves. The slaves were then generally sold or leased by the VOC to the owners of the farming communities who had been previously given land grants, and very quickly the number of slaves in the colonies surpassed those who were free. By 1710, by some reports, the adult slave population of the colonies outnumbered the adult colonist population by as much as 3 to 1. The VOC did not seem to have a high opinion of those who had been given land grants to set up the independent farms of the colonies. In 1662, the governor of the colony described the free farmers as, quote, sodden, lazy, clumsy louts, since they do not pay proper attention to the slaves lent to them, or to the work in the fields, nor to their animals, for that reason seem wedded to the low level, and cannot rid themselves of their debts. He reported that around 75% of the children born to slaves in the colonies had Dutch fathers, likely because the women were forced into sexual as well as labor slavery. But his only proposed solution was to call for more Dutch women to be sent to the colony. By 1672, records show that 300 employees of the VOC were contacted by the colony, and that 64 independent farmers, known as freeburgers, were listed as being granted land in the surrounding areas. Over time, the number of land grants for farms expanded, with over 250 by 1705 and up to 435 in 1731. And many of these farmers were able to become quite wealthy as a result. In 1731, it's estimated 7% of the free settlers owned 50% of the privately held total land around the colony. With the increase in available land grants, more Europeans were able to be enticed to come to the colony, including some Huguenot refugees from France seeking to escape the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. Some Germans also fled to the area for similar reasons, but the barren nature of the land attracted fewer immigrants than other destinations. Even with this influx, the primary language of the colony remained Dutch, as the VOC required it to be the language of schools and church services. Still, the total population of European descent remained a relatively small number, with the governor estimating in 1754 the count to be around 6,000. Still, as the colony grew, some of the freeburgers began to settle beyond the boundaries established and agreed to. This settlement outside the negotiated boundaries was frowned on by the VOC. In 1780, the governor wrote of his concerns by saying, quote, the anxious hope that no more extension should take place, and with heavy penalties forbidding the rambling peasants to wander beyond. Those who ignored the government's restrictions to set up farms beyond the colony's borders were known as Boers. Those who engaged in nomadic pastoral activities outside the boundaries were called Trekboers. These groups' relations with the native people was a mix of conflict and trade. But even when it was trade rather than conflict, the native people were often being exposed to diseases such as smallpox, which had generally not reached this far south into Africa. Either interaction would often decimate these small rural communities. In 1794, during the Wars of the French Revolution, the French were able to occupy the Dutch Republic, and the VOC found itself in serious financial distress. The British, who were also at war with the French, sent a naval force to the Cape Colony, and after a short battle, the colony was forced to surrender in August of 1795. Initially, this attack was likely to keep it from the French rather than to actually hold the territory itself, and the British allowed the Dutch to take back control in 1803. But the British Crown and the Dutch colonies had long been in competition, which is likely why the British returned to recapture the colony in 1806 for good. At the time of the British occupation, the estimated European immigrant population was between 20 and 26,000, with another 30,000 or so slaves. In addition, Around 15,000 Hoeksan and around 1,000 former slaves or descendants of former slaves were technically free residents in the immediate area around the Cape, but were generally treated as being separate from the colony itself. Roughly 16,000 of the Europeans lived near the Cape Colony, with the rest spread out over a territory spanning around 100,000 square miles. In addition to occupying the Cape Colony, the British expanded the colony in 1820 by convincing around 4,000 Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and English to move to an area on the eastern frontier of the colony. The intention was to have these new immigrants form a buffer between the existing colony and the neighboring native Xhosa people. These English settlers were given land grants, equipment, and food, but many were tradespeople rather than farmers. Having little farming experience, let alone experience farming in the conditions of South Africa, many failed and instead moved to existing settlements. The British ended slavery in 1834, but freedom included a required 4-year so-called apprentice program, which was functionally indentured servitude, at the end of which little or no pay was given. This left slaves with few options other than agreeing to continue working for the landowners under whatever terms they demanded. And the British, like the Dutch before, were either unwilling or unable to stop violence against native peoples, particularly from the Boer and the Trapper. The Boer, who had long resisted VOC rule, were even less inclined to accept British law. Many of the Boer moved further north in what is now known as the Great Trek, some founding autonomous so-called Boer republics throughout the region. These were known as Voortrekkers. The Boer were often able to force native people off their land, which the British referred to as Kaffirs, either by using superior weaponry or by calling for assistance from the colonial governments. This continued under British rule, although they were at times condemned by the British. The British governor in 1837 wrote that Kaffirs had ample justification for war. They had to resent and endeavor justly, though impotently, to avenge a series of encroachments. But the Boer weren't always able to overpower. A group known as the Zulu had recently been consolidating power over what had been largely disconnected groups of black Africans in the region. As some Boer groups began encroaching on their territory, the normal violence and intimidation methods which worked when facing smaller, disconnected pastoral groups was less effective. Reportedly, some of the leaders of the Boer sought to negotiate with the Zulu king named Dingane. If this negotiation was in good faith from either side is widely debated. Most seem to agree that a meeting was scheduled where the Boer were to bring cattle that had been stolen to a agreed place where they would meet Dingane. Many argued the Boer had been making threats to take the land regardless of any negotiation outcome, as they had taken the lands of the Zulus' neighbors. And additionally, the Boer did not return all of the cattle as they had promised, and some reports also indicate that Dingane had asked for horses and guns, and seeing those had not been brought, as well as the shortage of cattle, made Dingane think the Boer were acting in bad faith. If it was intended to be a meeting in good faith by the Boer can never be known, as reportedly shortly after the meeting began, Dingane's men attacked and killed the roughly 100 Voortrekkers. This led to open war between the Zulus and the Voortrekker Boers. While they were fewer in number, the Boers had superior weaponry, and that proved decisive. Also, the Zulu began to engage in a civil war among themselves, which led to a new ruler of the Zulu Empire who reached an agreement with the Boers on land borders. But Boer independence was short-lived as the British sought to annex the area that they had occupied as Boer republics. Boer Republic forces attempted to resist, engaging in a number of battles with British forces, and even allying at some point with the Zulus against the British for a brief time. But they eventually accepted British annexation in 1843 after negotiations. Prior to 1847, the British position, at least officially, had been to encourage negotiation of land deals with the native people of the area. But when a new governor was appointed, he issued a proclamation on December 17, 1847, to extend the colony's borders significantly to both the north and east. When the native Xhosa people protested, he met with local leaders and pronounced the claims the land were not part of the colony, but would be called British Kaffraria and administered separately. While the Xhosa resisted the decree, it was also a decree that didn't require much of them initially. Their leaders were generally left in place, and the governor indicated they could only be overruled if the British chose to do so. Other British policies also alienated and antagonized people of the region. Since 1841, the British had begun proposing using the area as a penal colony, similar to how they used colonies in Australia. When they tried to follow through with this plan, the first penal ship was sent to the colony in 1849. A large multiracial protest of an estimated 5,000 took place in Cape Town, which at the time only had a population of 20,000 people in total. When the ship arrived in September of 1849, officials refused to allow the prisoners to disembark or be resupplied, leading to a standoff. The British captain overseeing Cape Town was compelled to comply with the orders to give provisions to the ship, but the prisoners were not allowed to disembark, and after 5 months, the ship continued on to Australia. But the captain who followed the order to supply the ship was reportedly so ostracized by the Cape Town community that when his daughter fell ill, doctors refused to see her, and on his daughter's death, he did leave the colony. Perhaps because they saw the discontent of the colony as an opportunity, also leaders began organizing a resistance force. The governor called for the leaders to meet with him, and when the order was ignored, he declared the chiefs were no longer allowed to rule, sending forces to arrest the Xhosa leaders and put in place a British magistrate. But declarations were just words. Xhosa attacks on border settlements increased, and Xhosa forces, including many Xhosa police who had been working for the colony, left with their weapons to join the uprising, and were able to surround and capture a fort known as Fort Cox. Some Khoikhoi, formerly allied with the British, also joined the uprising as it grew, but others kept their orders and supported the British defense of the Cape Colony. In time, British forces were able to put down the uprising, but all this made clear that changes were needed. In 1854, the British were compelled to allow the colony to create its own parliament and constitution. That same year, a cattle lung disease began to spread throughout the colony. Europeans had been able to diversify with sheep herds, but the Xhosa were still primarily focused on cattle. Reportedly, a young Xhosa girl had a vision where a spirit told her that if the cattle were slaughtered, ancestor spirits would come and help expel the white settlers. This belief was spread among the Xhosa leaders, leading to the culling of an estimated 400,000 cattle over the next 4 years. This led to the starvation of over 40,000 Xhosa when the prophecy was not fulfilled. The governor of the Cape Colony reportedly issued instructions that the colonists were not to aid the Xhosa unless they signed into labor contracts with settlers in the area, and claimed it was all a conspiracy by the Xhosa leaders to create desperation among them to restart the rebellion. This pretext was also used to justify additional land claims to the areas affected, and the weakening of Xhosa allowed the British to assert authority over their land. In 1867, diamonds were discovered in the interior of South Africa, leading to a kind of diamond rush into the interior. By 1871, 4 major diamond mines were established, fundamentally changing the economics of the colony at a time when the colony was in economic decline. For some time, the British government had been trying to convince the Boer republics and the indigenous groups to become part of a larger confederation under British rule, without success. The mineral wealth made the British less inclined to just ask. The British annexed the Boer Republic of Transvaal in 1877 and sent an ultimatum to the Zulu in 1878 that if they did not agree to be annexed, the British would invade. The Zulu did not agree. Just 11 days into the conflict, in January of 1879, the Zulu were able to ambush a British force of approximately 1,800 soldiers, and although the Zulu were operating with outdated weaponry, they were able to completely overwhelm the British troops, reportedly killing an estimated 1,300 in the battle. But the British regrouped and reinforced, and by July 4th, they were able to capture the Zulu capital. The Boer were also not inclined to accept British rule. Reportedly sparked by the arrest of a Boer whose wagon had been seized to be sold for tax, the Boer engaged in guerrilla warfare, using what came to be known as the commando forces to ambush British convoys. This began what came to be known as the First Boer War. The British suffered heavy casualties and decided rather than reinforcing and regrouping as they had against the Zulu, to instead cut their losses and negotiate, signing a peace treaty in 1881 that allowed the Boers semi-independence. It also sparked a call for unity among the various Boer republics and a call for the creation of a nation-state of South Africa. The Afrikaner Bond Party formed in opposition to colonial rule, and newspaper reports supporting them wrote, quote, "The Afrikaner Bond has for its object the establishment of a South African nationality by spreading a true love for what is really our fatherland. No better time could be found for establishing the bond than the present, when the consciousness of nationality has been thoroughly aroused by the Transvaal War. The British government keeps on talking about a confederation under the British flag, but that will never be brought about. They can be quite certain of that. There is just one obstacle in the way of confederation, and that is the British flag. Let them remove that, and in less than a year, the confederation will be established under the free Afrikaner flag." But when more minerals were found, including a large deposit of gold that created a gold rush to the interior, the British interest was renewed, and was now well funded by diamonds, gold, and other mineral deposits. The British South Africa Company was chartered in 1889 by Cecil Rhodes to take advantage of these opportunities, and in 1890, Cecil Rhodes became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. His company, known as the British South Africa Company, was able to use the mineral wealth to create a private police force known as the British South African Police, which functioned more or less as a private military force. To assure control over the land where the new mineral wealth had been located, the Rhodes government used racial politics in the Cape Colony to take ownership of more land and assure continued control over its governance. He passed laws that allowed the government to take control of land which belonged to native black populations, while also tripling the amount of land that one needed to own in order to have the right to vote. This functionally disenfranchised much of the black population of the colony who had never been eligible for land grants, as well as some poor whites who were not property owners. His government also put limits on how much land blacks could own and where they could own it, further cementing this disenfranchisement. He argued that black South Africans must be driven off their lands to, quote, stimulate them to labor, and that, quote, that in future 9/10 of them will have to spend their lives in manual labor, and the sooner it is brought home to them, the better. Rhodes believed, quote, the native is to be treated as a child and denied the franchise. We must adopt a system of despotism, such as works in India, in our relations with the barbarism of South Africa. He argued that native people should be treated as, quote, a subject race. I do not go so far as the member for Victoria West, who would not give the black man a vote. If the whites maintain their position as the supreme race, the day may come when we shall be thankful that we have the natives with us in their proper position. Rhodes also attempted to disrupt the Boer republics, showing his motivations weren't entirely racial. The discovery of gold near what is now Johannesburg led to a mass influx of mostly British migrants to the region. Believing these newly arrived immigrants might be interested in rebellion against the more established Boer Afrikaners, he hired 500 members of his private police force to incite an uprising in the area in December of 1895, and this force would then seize control of the Boer Republic territory. Leander Starr Jameson was put in charge of the operation and had about 1,000 men armed with rifles, as well as some machine guns and artillery. But the new immigrants weren't interested in joining a rebellion, and the raid was a total failure. Most of its leaders were detained, and the British South Africa Company was forced to pay the Transvaal nearly $1 million in compensation. Rhodes initially denied involvement, but once his role was clear, he was removed from the board of directors in 1896. But he remained an influential shareholder, and eventually functionally regained control of the company just 2 years later. The recent influx of foreigners had made the Boer a minority in the area around Johannesburg, and the attempt made clear that it was only a matter of time before the British once again tried to take over their territory. Germany sought to feed into this tension by supplying rifles and ammunition, and the Boer states agreed to work together to resist the British. The leader of the Transvaal Boer Republic issued an ultimatum demanding all British forces leave Transvaal in October of 1889. Many in the British press did not take this threat seriously, with the editor of the Times reportedly saying, quote, an official document is seldom amusing and useful, yet this was both. An editorial in the Daily Telegraph wrote, quote, of course there can only be one answer to this grotesque challenge. Kruger asked for war, and war he must have. But the British Army knew otherwise, with Prime Minister Lord Salisbury reportedly telling the Queen, quote, we have no army capable of beating even a second-class continental power. At the start of the war, the Boer could field around 33,000 troops, while the British could only get around 12,000 quickly to the fight. The Boer were able to capture several settlements over the remainder of 1889, but by January the British were able to mount a counteroffensive as reinforcements arrived. They captured the capital of Pretoria in June of 1900, forcing the Boer into guerrilla war for the entirety of 1901. The British responded to the guerrilla attacks by implementing a scorched earth policy. They destroyed crops, poisoned wells, and sent Boer families to internment camps to starve the Boer of any supplies. The conditions in the internment camps were brutal. Reportedly, 93,940 Boer were held in squalid conditions. Of those, 27,927 died in the camps, the vast majority being children under 16 years of age. But it wasn't just the Boer who were sent to internment camps. At least 115,700 black Africans were sent to separate internment camps by the British to deprive the Boer of their labor. At least 14,154 black Africans died in these camps during the war, but that number is almost certainly an underestimate, as the conditions of those camps were often worse and records were very poorly kept. A report on these camps was completed by a team led by Millicent Fawcett. Her report stated, quote, the main decisions, or their absence, have been left to the soldiers, to whom the life or death of the 154,000 Boer and African civilians in the camps rated as an abysmally low priority. 10 months after the subject had first been raised in Parliament, the terrible mortality figures were at last declining. In the interval, at least 20,000 whites and 12,000 colored people had died in concentration camps, the majority from epidemics of measles and typhoid that could have easily been avoided. By early 1902, The Boer guerrilla forces were severely weakened, and the British were looking for a path out of the conflict. A treaty was signed on May 31st, 1902. The British promised eventual self-governance in exchange for the Boer surrendering and swearing allegiance to the Crown. The Boer would still be able to teach Dutch and would maintain their property rights, and would receive $3 million in reconstruction aid, as well as general amnesty. In addition, the Boer specifically negotiated that voting rights for black Africans not be discussed until after self-government was given, assuring that even in surrender, the Boer would maintain their land, and with it, their power over the black African community whose land they had claimed and been granted by the European legal authorities. By 1910, the British had negotiated agreements with all of the various Boer republics, which had brought them under one umbrella, known as the Union of South Africa. And while the British and the Boer may have had disagreements on many other issues, there was one issue they were able to work together on: suppression of the power of black Africans. While whites constituted only around 20% of the population, the laws had provided them 90% of the land. In 1913, the Natives Land Act was passed, making it illegal for black people to buy land from white people without special approval from the government. Technically, the law also forbade whites from buying from blacks, but the law designated roughly 13% of the total land area of South Africa to blacks in a communal purchase setting, and in practice, really only provided around 7%. This land was given to local chiefs through technical rights, but its communal requirements made it functionally impossible to sell or even use as collateral for loans to fund any commercial products. The law also forbade any kind of sharecropping or tenant farming, meaning blacks who lived in white areas were only allowed to work as wage labor, making them completely dependent on white landowners, where prior blacks could rent farm plots and share the profits. This removed any chance for black farmers to have income beyond what the landowner was willing to pay them, and ensured the landowner would always have leverage. As a journalist and political activist Sol Plaatje described it, quote, "Awakening on Friday morning, June 20th, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth." But even as they found common cause in repressing the black majority, many Boers still resented British rule. When World War I broke out, and the British called for South African support, a brigadier general by the name of Christian Frederick Beyers wrote, quote, "It is sad that the war is being waged against the barbarism of the Germans. We have forgiven, but not forgotten all the barbarities committed in our own country during the South African War." A Boer lieutenant colonel named Manny Maritz issued a proclamation that read, quote, "The former South African Republic and Orange Free State, as well as the Cape Providence and Natal, are proclaimed free from British control and independent, and every white inhabitant of the mentioned areas, of whatever nationality, are hereby called upon to take the weapons in their hands and realize this long-cherished ideal of a free and independent South Africa." He declared a return of the Transvaal Republic and was able to muster a force of around 3,000 men who could occupy some areas, but this rebellion was quickly crushed by the South African government. Maurice escaped to Spain, but would later return and become a spy for Nazi Germany. And he was not alone. A pro-Nazi party, calling themselves the Ossawa Brandwag, was willing to conspire against the Allies to help Germany. They sent a telegram claiming to offer 160,000 members and 15,000 troops toward the Nazi cause. They wrote, quote, "At an hour to be determined by the German High Command, Afrikaners would then blow up all rail and road bridges connecting the Transvaal with Natal. The railway personnel, the police, and 26,000 mine workers and employees have been penetrated, as the rest of the state services with Ossawa Brandwag members, and would go on strike. The latter, viz. Mine workers and employees, are ready today for urging for a strike. English newspapers are going to be blown up. Smuts and his followers are going to be asked to kill themselves. Further dispositions are left to the German General Staff, particularly whether which bridges are to be blown up." But before they could follow through on their promise, the government cracked down on the group, putting some members in internment camps. But some of those interned would still go on to successful political careers in what would become the National Party, including future Prime Minister John Vorster. In between the wars, the South African government continued to add laws to limit the powers of non-white South Africans, particularly indigenous South Africans. In 1918, the Natives in Urban Areas Bill limited where black South Africans could live in urban areas, and in the 1923 Urban Areas Act laid out clear segregation zones. In 1926, the Color Bar Act forbade mine workers from engaging in many skilled trades to assure white monopolies in these fields. And in 1927, the Native Administration Act gave the government the power to arrest blacks at their discretion for more or less any reason. The law stated, quote, "Any person who utters any words or does any other act or thing whatever with intent to promote any feeling of hostility between natives and Europeans shall be guilty of an offense and liable on conviction to imprisonment not exceeding 1 year or a fine of £100 or both. In 1936, the Representatives of Natives Act removed the few remaining black voters from the general roll who met the qualifications, putting them into a separate voting pool that only allowed them to vote for a candidate among 4 representative options, all of whom were white. Even with all these laws in place, in 1948, right-leaning nationalists under the Reunited National Party, also known as the HNP, argued that the ruling United Party was not doing enough, and that keeping the ruling party would eventually lead to black government in South Africa. The HNP ran on a policy they called Apartheid, using openly racist slogans which translated to Black Peril, the Kafir in his place, and the coolies out of the country. In addition to the racial call, they claimed the ruling United Party was sympathetic to, if not linked to communist leadership, and intended to institute land reforms. All of this appealed particularly to rural white Afrikaners. And because of how the seats were allocated, despite the HNP only receiving 37% of the vote to 49% to the United, the HNP won 70 seats to just 65 for the United. The Afrikaner Party won roughly 4% of the vote, but were able to get 9 seats. And despite their long conflicts with the government, again, there was one issue they could agree on: the repression of the black majority. And so the Afrikaner Party allied with and then eventually merged with the HNP to create the National Party. Combined, they had a ruling majority of eligible voters, which again excluded blacks, who were the majority of the people living in the country. Once in power, they kept their promises with regards to apartheid. In 1949, interracial marriage was formally made illegal. In 1950, this was expanded to sexual intercourse. That same year, the Population Registration Act classified every South African on racial criteria, defining white as, quote, in appearance is obviously a white person who is generally not accepted as a colored person, or is generally accepted as a white person and is not in appearance obviously a white person. Because of the ethnic diversity of South Africa, this classification system initially placed everyone into 4 groups: African, white, Indian, and colored. But over time, the Indians were included in the colored designation rather than separately. Some immigrants from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were granted so-called honorary white status, but Chinese immigrants were more likely to be classified as colored or given an entirely separate designation, as many descended from Chinese labor brought during the early gold rush and were therefore still needed as a labor class along with many Indonesians, those who had been brought as slaves in the early days of the Cape Colony. The distinctions for these groups could come down to things like the pencil test, where a pencil was put in the hair of a person and was made to shake their head. If the pencil stayed in, they were declared black. If it fell out, they were declared colored. This could lead to members of the same family having different racial identifications. Also in 1950, they passed the Group Areas Act that forbid non-whites from living in many areas and required non-whites to carry paperwork on them, referred to as passbooks, which were required to be able to enter in some areas. In 1952, the law was expanded, adding provisions that made it illegal for most blacks to even be in many urban areas for more than 72 hours. In 1953, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act made most municipal services segregated, including hospitals, beaches, parks, and even things as simple as benches. Also in 1953, the Bantu Education Act changed the educational programming of black Africans. The programming now focused on specific, limited, generally low-paid vocational training, and largely defunded many rural schools, even those run by missionary groups. The Minister of Native Affairs said this was done because, quote, there is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. It is of no avail for him to receive a training which has its aim absorption into the European community. He went on to say, quote, what is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? By 1968, the state spent 16 times the amount per white child than it did per black child, with blacks having no ability to access most universities and colleges. In 1955, one of the only remaining urban areas where black Africans were allowed to reside was Sophia Town, just outside of Johannesburg. On February 9th, police forced the 50,000 residents from their homes, loading their belongings into trucks to send 12 miles away so that the area could be bulldozed to create a new white suburbs. This pattern was repeated over and over again in urban areas all around South Africa. forcibly removing around 600,000 people. In 1959, even the ability of some blacks to nominate and vote for token white representatives was removed, as well as their right to vote entirely, in an ironically named bill called Promotion of Black Self-Government Act. This law set to create separate autonomous government areas, and blacks would then no longer be citizens of South Africa, and instead would be reclassified as migrant workers from the various areas created by the state. Over time, millions of black Africans were forcibly removed from their homes, and were often sent to areas where they had never lived based on their ethnicity. In total, 20 so-called homelands were created, 19 for black Africans, and the 20th being called Basterland. This was an area set aside for a group of mixed ethnic origin, who generally have some European Afrikaner in their history, but not enough to be seen as white. As these areas became autonomous, citizenship was revoked entirely, and passport requirements for entry became passport requirements. Throughout all of this, black Africans actively tried to resist. In 1950, the African National Congress, known as the ANC, called for a series of strikes, boycotts, protests, and other civil disobedience actions, which at times led to violent clashes with the government. In 1959, a protest against the requirement to carry passbooks was called by a splinter group from the ANC, known as the Pan-African Congress. This protest took place in the township of Sharpsville, and around 5,000 people attended the protest, which called for them to come to an area without their passbooks in defiance of the law. The protesters, who were peaceful, were told by government officials that they would meet with them to address their concerns, but they should wait outside of the police station in the area until officials could come. But the truth was, once sufficient reinforcements arrived at the station, police opened fire on the crowd, killing at least 69 people and injuring over 200 others. The government then called for a state of emergency and arrested 18,000 people, including the leaders of the ANC and the Pan-African Congress. Both groups were then banned. In 1961, following a referendum, South Africa became a complete independent of the British monarchy, becoming the South African Republic. In May of that year, ahead of the scheduled inauguration celebration for the new state, a group connected to the banned ANC threatened demonstrations and strikes during the event if the new government refused to meet with them. When the government refused to meet, the strikes took place, but were brutally put down by police, who were given the authority to arrest and hold people for up to 12 days just to break the strikes. One of the organizers of this strike was Nelson Mandela. Mandela later rated the protest, quote, "The lesson I took away from the campaign was that in the end, we had no alternative to armed and violent resistance. Over and over again, we had used all the nonviolent weapons in our arsenals: speeches, disputations, threats, marches, strikes, stayaways, voluntary imprisonment, all to no avail." Mandela then went to help form a paramilitary group of the ANC to take more aggressive action. In June, he sent a warning letter to the South African newspapers, warning that unless reforms came, a sabotage offensive would occur in 6 months. Once again, the warning was ignored, so on December 16, 1961, on the anniversary of the confrontation between the Afrikaners and the Zulu, known as the Battle of Blood River, an electrical substation was sabotaged, and a nearly year-and-a-half-long series of attacks on infrastructure and sources of income from the state began. In 1962, thanks to a tip from the American CIA, Nelson Mandela was caught and arrested. At his trial, he said, quote, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideals of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to see realized, but if it needs to be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." In the mid-1960s, the Black consciousness movement began to emerge, inspired in part by the American Black Power movement. This movement was focused more on the empowerment of blacks rather than seeking concessions from whites. One of the leaders of the movement was a man by the name of Steve Biko, who wrote, quote, "I realized for a long time I had been holding on to this whole dogma of non-racism almost like a religion. But in the course of that debate, I began to feel there was a lot lacking in the proponents of the non-racist idea. They had this problem, of superiority, and they tended to take us for granted and want us to accept things that were second class. They could not see why we would not consider staying in that church, and I began to feel that our understanding of our own situation in this country was not coincidental with that of these liberal whites. As the movement spread, police crackdowns were constant and the group was banned in 1973. Biko was banned from speaking or even leaving the district where he lived. He said of the crackdown, quote, "My major problem at this point is a strange kind of guilt. So many friends of mine have been arrested for activities in something I was most instrumental in starting. A lot of them are blokes I spoke into the movement, and yet I am not with them. One does not think this way in a political life, of course. Casualties are expected and should be bargained for." In 1976, approximately 20,000 people took part in a protest in Soweto over attempts to force the Afrikaans language to be the primary language taught in the schools in the Black Township. Between 3,000 and 10,000 of these protesters were themselves schoolchildren. As the group peacefully marched toward the school, waving signs against the change, police unleashed dogs on them, and then opened fire, killing between 200 and 850 people. In 1977, Biko was traveling covertly to Cape Town, but was caught by police on August 16th at a roadblock on his way home. He was detained for 533 days before being beaten to death in police custody. None of those involved were prosecuted, despite the government initially claiming his death was from a hunger strike, before evidence exposed this to be a lie. By the 1980s, condemnation by the international community was growing. Even if it wasn't, it was becoming clear that the 16% white population was not going to be able to maintain permanent power over the 84% black population. In 1983, those designated as colored and Indians were given limited voting rights under what was called tricameral parliament. But this was not a true solution, and boycotts of the vote and riots followed. Nelson Mandela, who had remained in prison all of this time, became a rallying point to chants of Free Mandela at protests around the world. Some of the black homelands were declared official nations, and some property rights were modified, but these were largely token gestures. In 1983, the United Democratic Front emerged in South Africa under the slogan UDF Unites, Apartheid Divides. Made up of over 400 public organizations that included trade unions, faith organizations, and student groups, their mission was to create a, quote, non-racial United South Africa in which segregation is abolished and in which society is freed from institutional and systemic racism. The group called for international boycotts, which led the South African government to charge members of the group with treason. In part because of international sanctions, the South African economy was, by late January of 1985, in collapse. The government, looking for any way to get a relief from sanctions, indicated they'd be willing to free Mandela if he would agree to condemn violence against the regime. Mandela declined. He responded that the violence against the regime was because of the regime being unwilling to be democratic. In August, South African President P.W. Botha gave what came to be known as the Rubicon speech, where he made clear his intention for the government to maintain apartheid, stating, quote, "I believe we are crossing the Rubicon. There can be no turning back." As a result, international sanctions continued, and South Africa's economy completely collapsed, leading the state to default. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk took office after the long-serving Botha had a stroke. De Klerk had a reputation as being a conservative and pro-apartheid, so many were shocked when during his first address to Parliament on February 2, 1990, he announced the repeal of a number of apartheid laws and the lifting of bans on many opposition groups. Just over a week later, on February 11th, Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years. Over the next year, through negotiations, many of the apartheid laws were lifted. Responding to conservative backlash, de Klerk held a white-only referendum on if the reform should continue. 69% of white South Africans voted in favor of continuing reforms. In 1994, the first election where blacks were allowed to vote was held, and Nelson Mandela won nearly 63% of the vote, with de Klerk finishing a distant second with just over 20% of the vote. In 1996, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee was formed, authorized by Mandela and chaired by Bishop Desmond Tutu. De Klerk testified before the commission, saying, quote, "I apologize in my capacity as leader of the NP to the millions who suffered wrenching disruption of forced removals, who suffered the shame of being arrested for past law offenses, who over the decades suffered the indignities and humiliation of racial discrimination." Both had defied a subpoena and refused to testify. History is awkward.